We're recording. This is session 3 of Stuff Every Christian Should Know. Today in this session we're going to cover the days of creation. I think there's some things about the days of creation that we should talk about. There are a few facets of humanity that tell us about who we were before the fall, and that will include a look at both the image and likeness of God. I think that are two concepts that are absolutely critical to our understanding of who we are now and who we were before. We're also going to look at the narrative of the fall, and this will be sort of the beginning of the narrative section or the timeline of what we'll look at over the next few weeks. You could say it started with creation, but it really starts in terms of our understanding and our engagement in that with creation of humanity and the fall and really that sense of, I would actually argue that the sense of even time, not that time wasn't there, but the sense of tracking of time or awareness of limits happened after the fall. But we'll talk about that, and then we'll end today with theories of the original sin that will bring us up to basically Cain and Abel, and then when we start on the next session, we'll at a pretty good clip, we'll go through the history of Israel and just pause for certain theologies or concepts, but really afterwards start that narrative, we should be good. So before we begin with creation, was there any lingering thoughts from anyone from last week that they wanted to raise, or questions? Anything that they've been wrestling with? Okay, then let's start with the days of creation. These can be found in Genesis 1 through 25. This is what deals with, and I do want to, I told Jim I would bring this camera up closer. I will put it up here just for the sake of understanding. I think that it amazes me actually how often Christians don't know the parallels that exist in the created order. And it goes into a 3-3 sequence, or 3 on top of 3. So, but the doctrine we talked about last week was that God created out of nothing. So there was a void. There was no material world, that God was the only thing in existence. We call him the unmoved mover, that in the process of that something appeared. Some people call it the Big Bang. That would be sort of an atheistic or a rejection of God that just sort of spontaneously started. It could be that God started it with a Big Bang, which is also plausible, and God used that first cell, wherever it was, to come into being. But as we know, in the process of that first, that was whatever that being that came into sort of existence was, we would something called day one. And does anyone know, without looking, what was created on day one? Heavens and the earth. Day and night. Try again. Silas, whichever. Light from darkness. And this is important. And you're all close. Light from darkness. I'm going to keep this off there. Day one was light from darkness. Now, oftentimes we assume this was day and night, sun and moon, and it's important to remember that those things have a parallel, but this theologically is looked at possibly, in a number of ways, possibly the beginning of good and evil. Light from darkness in a much more non-physical way. The darkness, in terms of, was the void there? Was it darkness? Was it have an evil about it? There's no contention about, there's no debate about what it was before, and we don't know. But the abyss was there, and the notion of the light coming into the world. So I would say this first part here is very spiritual creation that exists, and I don't want to call the earth darkness or the earth light, because what God created was good. But this day one was not like the rest of creation, in the sense of it had a supernatural sort of origin. Day two, what was? Does anyone want to know? Heaven. The heaven from the earth, or from and this is where I would say you get the beginning of the material world, heaven And I would say heaven, well, there's an actual term. Heaven, firmament, the sea and the sky. Heaven and, I would, I almost want to say matter. You could say this heaven is the sky, is the planetary, system that surrounds us, the solar system, and that theory would be largely argued by people who see humans as purely unique and there is no other life force outside. I do deny to some extent multiple or continuous time sequencing, not necessarily other realities. I think God could do redemption. If God can design this world with this complexity, you could do this 1,000 times, 1 billion times, 1 trillion times over, and God could be just as present in those as God is in our world. But heaven and matter, or heaven and whatever you want to call it. But this could also be understood as the sky and the sea, and so. If you want to put that whole thing into the matter, the sky could be that which we see, and the sea could be basically the earth.
So in the message it says, he separated the water under sky from the water above sky.
And again, does that make any sense to you?
No.
No. That's a poetic, the message, Eugene Peters is using a poetic form. Okay. The firmament is sometimes it's called, but the point is there was no land, that it was just that when we think of the earth, it would be pretty much all water. So, whatever the contents or whatever the amount of the created order is water now, maybe it was a much larger sense, or maybe the planet was smaller. I don't know. God's doing all sorts of things. So the day 3, day 3 is land and sea, and so this is where you might, and if you have more of a separation of inhabitable or non-inhabitable in terms of sky and matter or sea or earth, then this would be almost the rising of. So you have a planet here that's all water, and then out of that planet you have some sort of form that's surfacing on that. Now, I think what I'm going to argue, and I would argue, is that whatever form this was that Pangea, was the earth, the mass of the earth that originally separates. You have seen, the map? You've never seen Pangea? Mm-hmm. It's basically if you take all the continents and you shove them together and they kind of fit. Okay. And then when you look at why do the West Indies have similarities to Africa? Why do the Philippines have some similarities to China, but also to Central America? And, there are all these sort of ethnic overlaps that when you put all those together, you start to see how they actually fit. But I like to think that this is where the Garden of Eden ultimately lands, in the center of that. This is before, and I'm not saying when things split, but now this here is the parallel. This is the first environmental creation. So the first 3 days were environmental. They were creating a context for what would happen in the next 3 days. And so if you remember on the 3-3 basis, there's actually a nice parallel. So on day 4, which mirrors 1, now what did we want to say was created? Before we talked about that? The sun and the moon, or day and night. Now, these are important juxtapositions because this means that there is some sense of time. And that doesn't mean people paid attention to it, but it means that the solar system was in place, that as the Earth spun, that there was some sense of orientation because of the stars in the sky. But what you get on day 4 is the entrance of what we would now call chronology, or time, or order. Now, in a true theory world, that in a theistic sort of setting, you could just say that there's never an end. It started at some point, but it could theoretically go on forever and ever and ever. And so time is something that we use to gauge for ourselves. But the notion that I want you to pick up is the notion of sun and moon were put into place. And I will say too, when we looked at the celestial beings, the Catholic Church and in the Orthodox Church, probably I can't say that for certain, but the Catholic Church definitively views the Hebrew word that is for rule. God said that I will give a sun to rule the day and a moon to rule the night. And that word rule is an active verb, and that then implies for Roman Catholics that there are actually celestial beings, however you want to illustrate that, that are guiding day and night. And hey, Tommy. And I buy,
Hey,
you see that? Is that better? I
yep.
buy into this ruling theory to a great extent, in large part because I've come to sort of view that there are natural laws by which God orders the world, and these were part of the introduction of natural law. Not that they weren't already up here, but in terms of there are celestial beings that are guiding gravity, that are guiding, qualities of water. In other words, everything in creation is infused with some sort of supernatural dominion or guidance. So we may just call them a law and look at them objectively, but from a Catholic perspective, everything within the universe is guided by something else. Now, that also leads me to say that when Jesus was performing miracles, so when he changed water to wine, he wasn't manipulating the molecules. He had command over those natural orders, principalities, powers, rulers that actually control those natural features, and basically commanded them to alter the ordered structure. So that's day 4. But you get that day and night juxtaposition with the light and darkness. See those connection there? So then day 5, which goes with 2, what do we have here? Heaven and matter, or sea or earth, sky and sea. And where this deals with environment, this deals with inhabitants. And the sun and the moon then become inhabitants of the created order as well. And then what happens on the 5th day, which parallels with the heaven and the sea and the sky, is birds, and fish. Both of which in a Jurassic or sort of a dinosaur theory of evolution of the world, well, they would have said those were the first creatures, because you would start with the fish, it would go to the sky, it would take flight, and they say raptors were originally birds, they weren't lizards. So that's where you would tie into some of that science of creative order. And then day 6, which parallels with 3, land and sea. What do you get there? You get land animals. You get land animals and you get humans. And humans are when it sort of differentiates. And so if you can see, the land animals go with the land and sea. You see separated, we already had sea animals, so now the land animals surface, and land animals. Now, again, going back to the theories of creation, did God snap that into existence? Did they evolve? We really don't know. It's all good as long as you credit 3 things that we said last week: that God created everything, that God created out of nothing, and that God sustains everything. Now, now we often say the 7 days of creation. I actually think the 7 days of creation is a bad way to say that, because God did not create on the 7th day. There was no created order on the 7th day. There was nothing. So you could say 6 days really of creation and a 7th day of rest.
But if he didn't create the sun and the moon until day 4, he wouldn't have started counting days until day 4.
Day 4, yeah. And I would say the time here, in my personal opinion, is you have millions and billions of years of this evolutionary process of, even if you just take, as we talked about last week, you could take this as just the environment evolved, and then when humanity came, they began with Adam and Eve. Or, as I shared last week, you could also have an evolutionary theory that brings humanoids into the picture. But what's important is that this just didn't happen on its own. This happened after a period. In other words, rest has often looked like God's tired, he wants to take a break, but rest really just means I'm done creating. I'm ceasing from the creative act. As I have to say, God's not bringing anything new, But if you think about it in terms of that evolutionary sort of unfolding, God's just basically saying, I'm done doing the major creating. And by the time Adam and Eve come on the scene, the created order of animals was perceivably done. So, but what's important to know is that in the midst of this is where humans come into play. In all of these days, or all of these epochs of creation, God says they are good. But when he comes to the humans, he adds a superlative. They are very good. Now, this shouldn't be missed. There's a reason they are very good. We'll come back to this notion of a day of rest here in a second, because that, again, that's a different quality of being. But what happened between the creation of humans and this period of rest, and this period in between, is very important. Because in the creation of humanity,
Jason,
yeah.
before you go on to that, maybe this is a dumb question, but
Oh, no dumb questions.
where in this process did God create the air or atmosphere?
I would say that air and atmosphere probably would have been created in the third day. I mean, I don't know in terms of oxygen, second day. I don't know. I mean, maybe second day here.
Yeah.
Not here, probably here. The creation of matter.
Well, land and sea would create, oxygen.
I mean, if you had water too, you would have oxygen and water, H2O. So yeah,
You have to have sea, you have to have air to make
I
water.
mean, somewhere in this area, between the day one and the day two. Again, these are chunks. That doesn't mean like God's like, okay, day one is done, let's move on to the next list. Yeah, because oxygen is not just for us. I mean, again, I think that the night, light from darkness, probably the heavens, because whatever is in the outer space, that's obviously the molecules, the cells, anything of of material or matter would have been created somewhere between the day one and day two. But again, who knows? I mean, we're all just theorizing here. Okay, humanity comes from two parts. When we talk about humanity, it comes from two parts of Scripture. One is Genesis 26 through 28, which is the rest of the chapter, and then up to Genesis 2 through 4. You may remember that there are, in the first three chapters of Genesis, there's actually two creation accounts. A lot of people try to reconcile them. I don't think they need to be reconciled. I think they do have two different focal points. Like, one is meant to sort of describe the beginning of the created order. One is to describe the relationship of humanity with God and with one another. Yeah.
Can you just repeat that again, please?
Just there are two different creation narratives. One deals with the fall itself and the sort of narrative that comes from that. The other deals with just what happened in creation. There are four sources in the Old Testament. There were priestly, there's the Yahwehist, there's dropping it, priestly, Yahweh. There are four sources. I can't remember off the top of my head. Priestly, Yahweh. Oh, Yahweh, what is it? I don't remember. Anyway, there are, so when they broke down the Pentateuch and looked at the first 5 books of the Bible, they had different records of them, and they come from different people groups that took this information, and they get placed together. So that's how you get two creation narratives. One deals with, the one in Genesis 3 deals more with the creative order. This is where you get man's relationship to woman. This is where you get the temptation. The other deals with what we're looking at here, which is how the beings came into play. This one is important. I would put, the second one we'll deal with when we talk about the fall. This one we're dealing with when we're talking about humanity. And you get some inkling of that in the second narrative of creation. But in this one, we're talking about humanity. So I don't even know if really I need to write any of this down. But here's the thing that we learn about in the narrative. One, we learn about the first time we have other than God created the heavens and the earth, and this God is this creator God is interacting. Let me sit down here, so I don't need to write it up there. Interacting with the created order, but when God goes to create humanity on this sixth day, something uniquely changes, and this is the first time we see a plurality of God. We let us create humanity in our own image. This is, I've heard this used in a lot of ways to abuse that in our current day and age and say this is about gender or sexuality. That is not what this is about. This is about a plurality of being. And part of one of the main reasons that we in the New Testament have the doctrine of the Trinity. For Yahwehs turn Jews, or in Judaism, we went from a view that God is. I'm getting a little feedback here. I don't know who that's from. Tommy, I'm going to mute you. You're the one that's not. If you want to ask a question, go ahead and unmute, just so we don't get the feedback. But we went from a view that God was the best God to God is the only God to God as three in one. And so we place this plurality into the radical monotheism of Judaism and in the Hellenization of Israel around just before Christ came on the scene. But the plurality of God, they, Father, Son, and Spirit, is the language we use. Creator, Redeemer, Sustainer is one that I typically like, that assigns sort of the role. That's not to say there is exclusivity. Jesus was in the mix of the Word, or the Logos was in the mix of creation. We believe that the Spirit hovering over the waters was the Holy Spirit. They are inseparable, and we truly don't really understand the full quality or nature of the relationship. So we just assert that there are three, but they let us create them in our image is an important part of the doctrine of the Trinity that we'll look at later. So I just want you to hang on to that. So the plurality of God. Two, the opposites of humanity. I know that in our current conversations, there's a lot of discussion just about a looser binary or an open, a non-binary, or saying there are things that fall in between man and women. And the truth is, biologically, there's intersex. There are people that are born with both genitalia. There are people who are born with a psychology that does not match their body. This is not to say that those things don't exist in culture, because they do, and that's not really a debatable thing. It's evident, but that fact that we have variation from that binary does not erase that binary. That God created us male and female in a complementarian way, based off of also what the created order also was demonstrating. So in the biological world, in the mammalian world, you had males and females, they procreated. Who was I talking to recently about peppers, and they were talking about splicing peppers and doing all these sort of, and I don't know what was anyway, it was the idea that plants have this sort of counterbalance, this complementarian way. Every single one of those processes are embedded into the biological order of what God created so that reproduction could happen. They all relate to a reproductive process. And that reproductive process is part of the way God created us. And one of the things that we'll see when we talk more about the covenants is the Adamic covenant was a covenant of grace because there was nothing done before it. And it was also a covenant that had a couple parts: be fruitful, meaning reproduce, multiply, or be fruitful in the sense of both, in the sense of humanity, and also in the sense of, I think, the labor and the tending and the care of the garden. Multiply points to the creation side of it. It wasn't just supposed to be two people. There was supposed to be an ongoing reproduction effect, and fill the earth, a spreading out. Those are important facets to understand. So when someone says, I personally think that they are the same, it's the same covenant we'll see again in Noah. Be fruitful, multiply, and fill the earth. So you want to talk about stuff that I think every Christian should know? Every Christian should know, be fruitful, multiply, and fill the earth. Because God wants to see us flourish. God wants to see us grow. God wants to see us multiply. And so that is the essence of the Adamic covenant. So God gave us opposites in order to accomplish that. In other words, the complementarian nature of the design of the way God created humans lends itself to the fulfillment of that divine covenant.
So all throughout the creation, the creation is also the creation of dichotomy, the concept of dichotomy.
Of opposites, yeah.
Opposites. And of the totality, or completeness of that.
Yeah. I mean, you can say that with the created order too. Light, darkness, opposite. Day, night, opposite. Sun, moon, again, light, and the same similar sort of thing, although the moon, we now know the moon doesn't have light, but even in the sense of land and sea, air and water, the air is nothing, water is something. So there's again, I think, now, the last, plurality, so the three things that I think are important to know about humanity are we were created in the plurality of God, and then we'll get to this doctrine of the Trinity, but I'll say it now, that when we look back at the doctrine of the Trinity and understand the nature of the Trinity, there are terms like social Trinity or economic Trinity that deal with the relationship in the terms of social and how they related to the rest of created order, the economic, what they did, how they functioned. A relational view of the Trinity is often where we get the term perichoresis, and I've talked about this many times in my teachings over the years, so the perichoretical relationship. Peri meaning around, choretical pointing to dance or timing or chronos. And so this is a combination of this perichoresis is the constant dance, the constant movement around. And we say in terms of understanding the Trinity, that is a constant place of self-giving. That the fuel that sort of drives this dance around, this perichoretical God, is the idea that they are constantly self-giving to the other. And in my head, I don't know if this is a good illustration to help you think of it. I kind of think of like one of those old school merry-go-rounds they just tore up out here from the playground, the last remnant from Gen X childhoods, where we had to slide down the 40-foot metal slide that's been baking in the sun in our polyester gym shorts, and we all had burnt hamstring areas by the time we were done. Well, the other counterpart to that was those spinning merry-go-rounds that once you get them going, they just don't stop, and everyone just sort of flies off it eventually. That's how you know you've won. But I kind of imagine the Trinity at three corners of that, and every time they self-give to the other, it pushes it. And it's just this constant sort of self-giving. So when we talk about a perichoretical Trinity, and we'll revisit that when we come eventually to the theories of the Trinity, that for me is the operating relational sort of model of the Trinity. And I think looking at the Trinitarian, the we creator God, in that way actually allows us or helps us understand what happened in the fall. So the the things that we need to remember about humanity: the plurality of God, the opposites of the divine order in humanity, or the opposite of humanity, male and female, and the covenant of grace. That God created us, gave us a covenant to be fruitful, multiply, and fill the earth. The things around that, I would say, just as sort of concepts that you might want to think about, but again, you don't have to remember all these. There's discussions over we were given dominion over the earth, not domination over the earth. And that dominion is not one that says, I'm going to use this for my gain, but if you take it from that perichoretical notion of the Trinity, that God is in a constant place of self-giving, that then we, having dominion over the land and over the animals, were meant to be there to extend self-care. Care for the other. Constantly self-giving care for the other. So we gave of ourselves as the original humanity to care for the garden. We gave of ourselves to name the animals. We gave of ourselves to care for one another. which means in that first one we jump ahead, when we think about the relationship between Adam and Eve in Genesis 3, the notion of Eve being a helper, we often forget that the narrative behind that is God first said, it wasn't just God put everything out, then God put Adam out there and said he's alone. God almost assumed that the animals would be his helper. But it wasn't the case that the animals were sufficient for that. So the second creation out of that was the creation of woman, according to Genesis 3, 2 and 3, I guess, that it comes out that that the helper was that initial first relationship. So, but we can't just say, here's Adam, and then Eve came on and she's subservient, she's there to kind of help him along. That helper defines the relationship they have with one another, because in that pure self-giving context of the perichetical Trinity, Adam was already in a posture of self-giving. So Eve coming on as helping in that self-giving means they are mutually and reciprocally self-giving.
Can I ask a question?
Yeah.
The way it's worded, it seems to imply that God gave the plants to the animals.
Yeah.
So where did carnivorous come into play?
So we don't see the eating of animals until Noah. So there are three major changes in the dietary needs in the Bible, and this is again sort of we can throw it in anywhere. In this state that they're in, we often call them fruitarians, but I'm sure it was more so non-tended vegetation. Not that there wasn't still some tending going on, but they weren't wrestling with weeds. There was a sense of, we could say fruitarian because it says, I give you every seed-bearing plant for food. Everything that's green, basically, you can eat it. So the animals were eating it. No one was eating anyone. The animals theoretically weren't eating each other. Everyone was sort of taking part in this vast vegetarian or fruitarian life. When the fall comes, as we'll look at in a minute, you see the introduction of plants of the field that require laborious tending, that require labor, the toil. And so there's a shift from being the receiver of God's gracious gift of food that I could just pluck off a tree. And I will say, the notion of needing water, if you're eating all fruit, is almost non-existent. We got a delivery in Chicago this is like when CSA's, Community Supported Agricultures, and Boxshan found these places. They were delivering us boxes of vegetable and fruit. I remember eating a point where I was eating so much fruit, I had zero desire to drink water because I was in this constant place of sort of, sufficiently giving myself. So even the plants are then giving us the moisture we need. So, is a river or clean water or that sort of thing even necessary in a fruitarian diet? Maybe not. Maybe it's in a supple environment that you just could just eat,
So it wasn't part of the original design that man would eat animals?
No.
Is that the reason Methuselah lived so long? And a lot of them,
That's the theory,
vegetation?
that Methuselah and anyone else who lived, because what happens, what we'll see, so plants of the field, and it says and then death is introduced. So now death is a factor into it, because before that, presumably, there was no death, so there was no end. If death is a result of the falls, we'll talk about in a minute, that means that now time factors into now that end. And then what happens is, we don't know how long Adam and Eve lived in the garden, or lived outside of the garden by themselves. Maybe they were cruising for 1,000 years, and then they finally had children. We don't know that happened necessarily. I mean, the sequence of that. We don't know how long Cain and Abel lived. Well, we know how long, I guess one of them, kind of. but those in that era. We don't, in other words, we don't know how, and we have some tracking of Methuselah, but my point in saying that is we often place these as like the day that Adam and Eve got there, they all failed that first day, they got kicked out, and then then all of a sudden 9 months later, Cain and Abel were on there, 10 months later, Cain and Abel were on the scene. Like, we could have thousands of years of existence in the garden before this happened. We could have thousands of years after. There's no proof of saying one or the other. It just is what it is. It was what it was. But until we started having humans track that sense of time, which is around the time often as viewed as Abraham, or around, we presume the time before Abraham. From Abraham on, we start to have a better sense of time. But all that's to say, to answer your question, the time between the Adamic covenant, be fruitful, multiply, and fill the earth, and then the destruction of the earth, and then the ark, and then God says to Noah, be fruitful, multiply, fill the earth, And now I give you animals for food, and the animals will have animosity towards you. And because, well, quite frankly, if you were trying to eat me, I would probably have some animosity towards you as well. But which is why I say dogs in particular, and somewhat cats, but dogs I think are the closest example of what a pre-fallen relationship with a animal that we have. Except for in the Philippines where they but so that's why I think dogs are, like dogs have a human quality. I mean, I think anything that relates on that level, but I think dogs are some of that, the closest relationship. Crows are still scared of us. Dogs are companions and and I think that was probably what all of the relationships were like. And we can't imagine that because we even in the psalmist says that, the lion shall lie down with the lamb. We're like, well, how does that work? But yet, if you look on Facebook and Instagram videos, you still see these things of like dogs hanging out with their best friend, the deer, or a tiger hanging out with, the pig or something. And you say, well, how does that happen? And I think that those are remnants, that's like glimmers of what it was.
Like the movie Mandy, that was the first time we saw it. Animals all getting along.
Yeah, there you go. In an idyllic world, we'll all get. Okay, so that's the relationship we have with the animals. So there are three things I just want you just to flavor it. So one, we were called to have dominion, to tend, to help, to be in this self-giving space. Two, and it sort of dovetails into that, 2:18 is where we get the narrative of the helper, of Eve being created as a helper. It's not good to be alone. That is the recognition that the communal nature of humanity is a part of our makeup. This is before the fall. We were designed to be in community. We were designed to be in relationship with the other that is a reflection of ourselves. And this is where you have the unity of the Trinity, each one as a part reflection of them, one to the other. We also, within the created order, when we look at one another, we realize the communal nature, see that reflection, we recognize we're not to be alone. Loneliness, honestly, is the worst epidemic we're facing right now in the Western world, even in the midst of being with people. And I think because what we've done is through these dumb devices that we're all addicted to, every time we get on it, it's between us and something that is non-living, and so this is why one of the reasons I advocate so much hard for games. Three, the notion of nakedness. That has been run through so many puritanical, pietistic, holiness movements that it has been sterilized of any theological significance. I have a major problem with that. One, if they were naked, all the animals were naked, no one was wearing anything. Of course, why would they have any concept that was even necessary? So on a very practical level, the nakedness, and then it says after the falls, we'll talk about, they realized they were naked and they were ashamed. I have a theory about that I'll explain in a second, but I want to say that the nakedness was, for theologically, points to the vulnerability, but the fearless vulnerability. So if we find ourselves in a place where we're vulnerable, like, I was talking with someone today about, I don't like sleeping in, Lynn, I was saying, I don't really like sleeping in tents. Like when Lynn Lampert said when he goes camping, he goes in a car. And I was like, oh, that's probably nice because then you have like glass and steel around you. And no animal's gonna come up to the tent or a sprinkler go off in the middle of the night, as it did in case we camped out in front of the house. But that sense but you're out and exposed and you're vulnerable, and that brings about fear, so a fearless vulnerability. Without shame, there was nothing to be ashamed of. They were in perfect harmony. There was no sense of dissonance. There was no sense of disaccord.
We had a trip to Kenya and stayed at a lodge, Kiko Lodge, where the guest rooms were cages. And all night long, animals were all around you.
Interesting.
Separated by nothing more than barbed.
You did have a curtain you could pull,
But you heard the snorting and
So the animals all walked through.
oh yeah, they were all.
You were the zoo.
we were the animal. We were in the cages.
Oh, that would be awesome.
It is cool.
It was awesome.
Yeah.
We could do our version of that where we could just tie people up to stake them
Did you stay awake all night?
Oh,
and put peanut butter on them and see how they,
Like a baby.
It was really cool, because they didn't come out till later, so.
yeah,
the
so you
phone-
sort of woke up by hearing their noises. But you were safe.
Oh, yes, totally.
But there probably still was fear when you hear the noise because because
You wonder, what's out there, and where is it, and they see us, we know they can see in the dark, we can't see.
in that sense, well, Shannon, we were talking about someone eating a meal in the dark, and Shannon was like, I don't want to do that. And that, but even that, because it's a sense of vulnerability. What are you bringing to me in the dark that you're expecting me to put in my mouth? But that, what we're talking about is the fallen human condition. And when I say that they were fearlessly vulnerable, it means that they had, that doesn't, there were still vulnerabilities, things could theoretically still happen, but they weren't fearful because those things wouldn't happen, because they were still within the boundaries of this paradise. Okay, so they, again, plurality of God, the importance of the opposites of humanity, the covenant of grace, and then amidst the second tier would be that we're called to have dominion, we're called to be communal, and nakedness in the story represents a fearless vulnerability, exposure without
They didn't
fear.
ever feel like they needed to have it for protection, like from the sun or the weather or the.
So now you're tapping a little bit into my theory. This is Jason speaking, is that the material nature of humanity before the fall was not the material nature of humanity after the fall. That when it says we were clothed with skins of animals, that it wasn't God giving us buffalo skin, and some will say that it is, some will say that that points to, and we'll talk about this a little bit more in detail, that points to how sacrifice was introduced, because God killed an animal to give human the skins. But then it doesn't, the shamefulness, I don't think deals with our skins being, that our private parts being exposed to one other person who we already were, I think it has to do with a sense of nakedness or shame, or the realization they were naked is that when they were enfleshed, that they felt the coolness of the breeze. They felt the harshness of the dirt on the ground and the stones on the ground. They heard the rustle of the wind and the leaves and didn't know what was in the leaves. And so the shame comes from the realization that they did something that put themselves into a position. And it wasn't nakedness per se in relationship to sex or sexuality or anything related to that. It was related to the fact that they could feel the world around them.
But the materiality, so.
They were incarnated into a non, and that's not to say that they weren't in the same physical form. Again, these are theories, we don't know.
Yeah.
But to me, it makes sense that the idea that they're, every picture of Adam and Eve is that they're standing behind something to cover their genitalia, and the woman her breasts, and that's like the portrait of their nakedness.
Oh, now you have a lovely fig leaf.
It was one of the phrases, the end of naked time, that the fall brought about the end of naked time. But it could have also been that nakedness, the vulnerability that it's talking about was that sense of being vulnerable to God, to one another, and then that vulnerability shifted because it went from a fearless vulnerability to a fear-filled vulnerability. The minute you imagine yourself as Adam and Eve, first humans, you have no fear of anything, food is provided for you, the animals are all hanging out with you, and now you're thrust into a world where God has given you a curse that we'll talk about in a second to cultivate the land, that God, that pain has entered the world, that the very notion of death has entered the world. And with that sense of anxiety and fear of what is yet to come. Before we get to the fullness of what happened in the fall, I just want to point to a few things about the image and likeness of God. It says in Genesis 1 that God created us in their image and in their likeness. These are concepts that have been debated over the course of 2,000 years, probably not that long, but probably actually longer than that. But in terms of the Christian church, we take our cues from, and I'll give you the shorthand of it, Jews have a literary device or literary feature of their writing that will often put two things that are meant to say the exact same thing. So there's the theory that image and likeness really represent one thing. And it's just thought that Jews put that. Now, later, scribes, the Masoretic scribes and on, as they dissected, as they understood these, you go back into Jewish literature, you find that the sense of that the image was, well, one, these were capacities, so the image was our capacities as humans, and the likeness was the righteousness of God. Which is fine when you think about that in terms of the notion of the fall, the consequences of the fall, and the loss of righteousness in the fall. So originally, image would be point to, and this resonates too with Western Christianity. It resonates with both Catholicism and Protestantism. There is a very large overlapping Venn diagram of how people see these in our culture, the image and likeness of God. But historically, from Judaism all the way to the present, the image of God has been understood as rationality, logic, reason, our capacity to reason, creativity, to be creators of something, and this is how we end up with being able to go to space, because we've created, we've constructed. Relationality, that points to the Trinitarian relationship, and self-awareness, and there are some other words that sort of relate in the same vein, but they kind of deal with human capacities that distinguish us from, in Calvin's word, the brute beasts. The likeness historically has been understood as holiness, righteousness, and to some extent perfection. And what we often will say, and we'll talk about what the different views of the original sin here in a minute, but what they will often say is that that our image, all of those capacities that we have for rationality and reason and relationality and etc., that they became marred or affected. This is a general view. This is a slightly slanted Presbyterian view, but I'm going to go over the other ones in a minute. And that in the likeness, we lost the likeness. The likeness was...
In the likeness we lost.
The likeness we just lost.
In the fall we
In
lost
the fall, we lost it. So when we fell, you're no longer righteous. Now you're part of the wickedness. You're no longer holy. You're no longer set apart. You're no longer perfect. You're not these things. And again, there's two major views. One, they're the same in Jewish literature. Two, they sort of fall into these two categories. Now, what I will say is, and this is Jason speaking, I've done a fair amount of study on the image and likeness of God in relationship to play, and I started talking about play as being a better engagement for the image of God, because when we play games, we're using rationality and logic and reason and strategy and these things. We're being creative in how we put ideas or concepts together. We're relating to other people at the board game table, and we have to be self-aware of how we are operating within the system. So all of those things and other facets come into play in a board game. And so I was saying, so for the last 8 years, I've taught about the theology of play being capturing the image of God, capturing these attributes, and those attributes being displayed more so in a game than often in worship. And I take that as both a critique of me and the tradition, and also, this is actually kind of what I taught about at TopCon this past year, the Theology of Play conference that we go to in the winter. But and then I traditionally have taught the likeness of God as being something we lost. But where I was challenged over the last year was witnessing my mother with vascular dementia move to a place where she had a brain of 1.5 to 2-year-old with the vocabulary of a 77-year-old, and the stubborn will of both.
Terrible too.
Yeah, terrible 77s. But what came to me in this, and what I really began wrestling with seriously over the last year, was this very formed, very informed view of the image of God as being these attributes, and my mom not possessing any of them. She was not she had no rationality. She wasn't thinking logically. Her reason was always off. She had zero creativity about her. I mean, for the most part,
She had been capable of playing Candy Crush.
No,
A game.
not even.
Not in community, so it wasn't that wasn't the issue.
In the last 6 months of her life, we played a game called Chicken with her, where she had to roll dice. I don't know, maybe 6 months, or I don't know, maybe even longer than that. And pretty much we would say, here's some dice in your hand, and she would roll them. And was her participation. No idea what she's doing, no idea why she's doing it.
She always wanted it to be her turn. Or throw them
She
off.
just wanted to take them and she just wanted to, and when she rolled them, oh yeah, she was at a craps table, like, they'd be like, no, just hold it, just keep them on the table. Yeah, I mean, but all that's to say is, I started struggling with the idea of, we say the image of God is in all humanity, but if the image of God is tied to these capacities, these attributes, then does that mean the image of God is less than in my mother? And that was not a sufficient answer for me. And not just for my mother's sake, but for anyone who's mentally challenged, physically challenged, whatever condition they find themselves in dementia or otherwise. We don't say that about a child, because a child will say, oh, the child has capacity, they'll grow into that. But there is a nuance to the notion of the image of God being a capacity, and as a capacity for those. But then you could say, well, if it's just a capacity, then is it fuller in one sense or lesser than the others, as long as it remains a capacity? So what I did is I actually, in my mindset, I took this open, vast void of what the likeness is, other than the righteousness, which I think is a pretty simple answer, and said, what if the likeness of God actually are those attributes? Is those attributes? The likeness of God is the attributes. Because when we call Jesus the Logos coming into the world, it could also be translated as the logic coming into the world. And that logic coming into the world is a logic that we now can see the world in a different light. Look at the technological advancements that have happened since the arrival of the Holy Spirit over the last 2,000 years. That's a pretty significant expansion of mental, and capacity, and creative capacity, and logic, and all these things that wasn't there prior to that. I think that there's something about this notion of logic and rationality. So if we put those in the category of likeness, meaning that our likeness was affected in the fall, meaning it was hindered or hampered, and that the restoration of that came in the Spirit, it provides a better framework, or a more clear framework, for why we hadn't totally lost it. They were still making pyramids and all sorts of crazy stuff. But pyramids aren't microchips that you can see Australia on your wrist. And so there was a vast, in 2,000 years, we see this acceleration of this. I think that's the Spirit. I think it's the return of the likeness, the restoration of the likeness. So then you might say, Jason, well, what is the present, or what is the image of God? And when I teach about, I think the image of God is the existence, the presence, the being, in philosophical terms, the ontology of God. It is when Moses said to God, what shall I tell them? Who shall I tell them sent me? And God says, tell them I am. This was not this is not foreshadowing Popeye. I am that I am. This was God saying that I am the true existence of all that there is. I am. It's a statement of being. I think that the image of God in us is that sense of being in the same way. It's how we are connected to that I am. Therefore, God's presence in us becomes the image of God in us.
With the Holy Spirit.
With the Holy Spirit. And I think that's not to say it was lost when to say that the Spirit was not on the earth would be like God just sort of, I think if God sucked God's fullness of God's Spirit out of the earth, we would just be obliterated. So there's a sense of the Spirit being in all of being. But that sense of the image of God that we find value in the other is not related to the likeness, their capacities, is related to the very notion of the uniqueness of their soul found in that notion of I am. Does that make sense? So I'm not saying, but what is important in this discussion is the recognition that we both have the image and the likeness, unless you're going to do the Hebrew or the Jewish thing and say they're both the same thing. They're just pointed to, and maybe they do. But if we're going to separate them, the question becomes, when we strive to be more like God, we are using the likeness to embody, to have the likeness becomes a means through which we can embody the very image of God for the creative order. All right, that's the image and likeness of God. Everyone still good? Any questions? Everyone still following?
Other
Jason,
Yeah, go ahead, Glenda.
What's the religious doctrine that some traditions hold that we all have like a piece of God in us?
Pantheism,
Yeah,
the
I
God,
mean, does that what you're saying, does that border on a kind of pantheism?
it's either pantheism or panentheism. One is God is everything, one is God is in everything. I think pantheism
Okay.
is
Yeah, well, that's the one.
God is everything, and
God's in everything. God's in nature. But what's the belief that we all have like a piece of God within us? And what you're saying about God's presence, how is that different?
it's one and the same. The idea that God is in all of us is the idea that God's image is in all of us, which means that God's presence is in all of us.
So does that make us divine?
Does it make us divine?
Right.
Yeah, that's a very Eastern Orthodox. The Orthodox say that God became.
That's not what I meant. I just meant that's like an Eastern, like the yoga kind of.
Well, it is, and it tends, but that doesn't surprise. But also in Eastern Orthodoxy, there's a sense of God became human so that we might become divine. And Mormons tap into that notion as well. But the Orthodox to meet us. Well, in the sense that we will. I mean, not that we'll be. Oftentimes we associate the word divine with meaning ultimate God being, but it's divine just means of another realm that is not the material realm.
Some cultures believe that their leaders are divine.
Yeah.
Whether they're born that way or they take on that attribute, I don't know, that's specific to the belief, but the Emperor of China was the Son of Heaven.
Oh, yeah.
He was divine.
Oh, yeah. Leaders throughout the history of the world have claimed some form of supernatural divinity or sanctioning. I mean, that's part of the reason the Israelites wanted a king. They wanted to incarnate the divine or have some physical representation of the divine that was living as opposed to a statue that was. Does that answer your question, Glenda?
Yeah, I think it's a fine line. I mean, I want to believe that we have God's presence within us. And that's what the image means.
Yeah,
But
I would agree too.
think-
That's what it is. That's what I'm arguing for.
Right. Right. And I agree with that. I think then it's kind of easy to cross over to say that there's a piece of God or we all have some divinity within us.
Well, I think we do. I mean, I think we have if the Holy Spirit dwells in us, then
Right.
we do have the divine dwelling in us.
Extension of that concept would be our body is a temple.
Yeah.
I mean, you can play that out, the ramifications of that concept.
It is. I mean, and I think and I grew up in the Assemblies of God where, your body was looked at as the temple, which is why you didn't drink, which is why you didn't smoke, I think that there's validity in that. There's also validity in the idea that you could also then have that tip to an imbalance of caring too much about your body or being focused on the health of your health almost becomes a god unto itself because you're trying to make the that was an argument for not having tattoos. So, but God was the first one to do bodily modification, circumcision. So piercings, circumcision, it's all fall in that sound, right? Yeah. Were you going to say something else, Chris? Did you have something else?
No.
Okay. But I think the last thing I would say, Glenda, is there's a difference between saying God is in us, God is us, and God is, so you can say the Spirit lives in us, you can, and then I don't remember which one is which, pantheism and panentheism. One is God is in, like God's Spirit or being is in everything. The other is saying God is, I think panentheism is that God is everything. Again, I don't remember whether someone can look it up, but those are the sort of major difference between those two. Okay, let's talk about the fall and the original sin. I don't want to spend too much time in the narrative of it, other than the fact that we have a serpent that comes along. Again, we don't know the time frame. You have, is it Satan? Is it the personified figure of Satan? Is it as a literal serpent? Is it just the tempter or the accuser? There are lots of theories around who it was, what it was. Was it a minion of Lucifer, or was it Lucifer himself? We don't know. The serpent is a representation. I like to joke that the serpent was a dinosaur and that had arms and legs, because part of the curse that the serpent receives is that it will slither on its belly for the remainder of its days and eat dust. And I don't think the dust is necessarily actual dust. I think the dust is representative of the material world. In other words, and I'm not saying the snakes are a symbol of the Satan or the devil, but it comes into play. But the idea of the serpent having arms and legs before that, more like a velociraptor or something, is important because it offers us a paradigm of before and after that will extend to other things. If the serpent had arms and legs before, now it slithers. If it didn't, if it now it's eating dust to the remainder of its days, it did not eat dust before that for the remainder of its days. So by the virtue of the proposition on one side, you can infer something from the other. So what were the physical effects? There was a change. They were kicked out of the garden, so there was a change in location. There was the introduction of death, and this is where I would say the introduction of death perhaps is that introduction into the material world where death now factored outside of the Garden of Eden, the putting on of the skins of animals, if you will, which had a end point to it. And I would say, going back to the idea of the image of God being existence or presence or dwelling, the death, the reason we fear death is because it is the proposition of non-existence. We only understand our existence in presence. The idea of non-existence we can realize in someone else when they die. They're not there anymore, but the fear of non-existence ourselves is the fear of the unknown, and part of that introduction of death into the world. When death came into the world, a question of what is on the other side began. There were three specific things. One, labor. You will work for your food. You will work for the plants of the field. I don't have it in front of me. I could read it here. Give me 1 second, and I'll read it. Maybe it's worthwhile just reading. Genesis. What did I say? Genesis 3 equals. Sure, NIV is great. The fall. We can back up into this anyways a little bit. So after they ate of the fruit, then the man and his wife heard a sound in the Lord God as he was walking in the garden in the cool of the day, and they hid from the Lord among the trees of the garden. But the Lord called the man, "Where are you?" Obviously just toying with them, as he knew where they were. Mm-hmm. And he answered, "And I heard you in the garden, and I was afraid because I was naked, so I hid." And he said, "Who told you that you were naked?" And again, that's just not to deal with piety. That deals, I think, with the idea that there was a realization that something had changed. Have you eaten from the tree that I command you not to eat? And it's obviously he's playing along with them. And then the man, what does he do? He blame shifts. The man said, the woman you put here, which I think is funny. The woman you put here, he's blaming God. She gave me some fruit from the tree and I ate it. Like, I didn't even know. She came up with the burger and I was like, I'll give it a try. And then the Lord said to the woman, as if playing along with their dialogue, "What is this that you've done?" And the woman said, "The serpent deceived me and I ate it." So she blamed shifts too. And then so God says, so the Lord said to the serpent, "Because of this, of what you've done, cursed are you above all livestock and all wild animals." So heightened place of cursedness. "You will crawl on your belly and you eat dust all the days of your life. I'll put enmity between you and the woman, and between your offspring and hers." And this is the first place of enmity between animals and humans. And he will crush your head and you will strike his heel. And that obviously is a foreshadowing to Christ in the Christian worldview. To the woman he said, "I will make your pains in childbearing very severe. in other words, or it's worse in some translations. So it wasn't that there was not some sense of sensation of being birthed, but very severe with painful labor, you will give birth to children. And then here's the second part of it, I think, that is interesting, and that is your desire will be for your husband and he will rule over you. I think the desire is the introduction of sexuality. I think the rule is patriarchy. And I think that's because they were put into a physical order. And I've often said, and I know, Glenda, we've talked about this before many times, if you stripped away any sort of ideology, any spirituality, and put us all into a big, dome, men would dominate because we are physically larger beings. And that's the law of the jungle, might makes right. And I think that rule over is in part of the given created order of the enfleshment that, I mean, and I don't know what male and female looked like in that regard before that, or if there were different capacities to sizes, but the sense of man ruling over woman was a part of the curse, which means prior to the fall, her desire was not for him, and he didn't rule over her in the same way.
What was the verb rule? Will rule?
Your desire will be for your husband, and he will rule over you. And so and the reason this is important is because now for those of us who confess that the Spirit lives in us and we are living beyond, living out of the Spirit, and that the image of God has been restored in us and the likeness of God has been restored in us, and we're going to talk about all those things. Well, if that's true, then we are looking to return to a pre-fallen state of relationship, which is why New Testament, Jesus, Paul, all talk about putting sexuality in check. And two, we move towards the end of patriarchy. It's not about men ruling over women. It's about us co-creating, collaborating, and bringing about God's kingdom.
So how do cultures operate then that have women ruling? There are still some.
There are some.
Of course, it's not.
I mean, I have a lot of jokes that come to mind why that be the case. I don't know. I mean, how those happen, I don't know. I mean, I'm sure we could probably trace back behavioral things. I think genetic things spread. I think there are people who are, more willing to be dominated. I think Filipino people are people who are not necessarily, warrior fighters. Not that there weren't warriors there, but they have been conquered by too many civilizations to be like, at some point someone would have been like, you know what, you probably don't want to attack the Philippines. Every time we go in there, they just keep beating us up. But there are qualities or facets or habits or dispositions that are bred within or that result in certain ways of thinking and being.
In some cultures, women like second class.
Still, yeah, I know today. They're still, because they're not living in a spirit-led sort of rejuvenation of God's image in us. I think the whole notion of the idea that we see the image of God in women and they see it in us is that sense of mutuality and equity. These are some of the basics. My theory of intergenerationality, why we need to be an intergenerational church, goes back to a pre-fallen state. What did God intend our relationships to be with one another?
Yeah.
Not one ruling over the other, but both helping each other in a self-giving expression of that perichoretical Trinity.
But even today in modern societies, there are examples where the men are given an outward perception of dominance, but cultural anthropologists would tell you that the women run the show.
Yeah.
Even the Chinese, the women dominate financially.
Yeah.
They control the purse string. But they let the men, do the bravado.
And that may be, and again, those are probably cultural and environmental and biological and a number of things that sort of, who knows, maybe they're spiritual too on that level. But I think that you can always trace back trends like that to something or to things. So the consequences, I would say, there are three main consequences, I think, that are not on a material level, that are more on a spiritual or sort of a meta-narrative level. One, separation. We are separated from God, and we were also separated from one another. Adam and Eve were thrust into the garden, and the first job there was like, hey, we got to take care of ourselves. Adam's probably thinking, you just got me kicked out. Why should I take care of you? And, you know, but think about that first. Imagine if we just dropped you in the woods tonight. Like all of a sudden we just said like, come on, Ken, and just grab you and we're like going to drive you, you know, an hour and leave you in the middle of the woods somewhere. Your first thought was, what am I going to eat? Where am I going to sleep? How am I going to protect myself? The internal self-preservation, self-interested tendencies are right there. How do I protect myself? As I argued this past summer, I think this is sin. Sin is the state of being that says I need to protect myself over and against you. This is why we're freed from this, because we don't have to protect ourselves, because this isn't our world, and we're free to give of ourselves in that way. Okay, so separation was one, sheer shame and fear, and I think that comes from what it could have been and what it is not. Fear from the world around us of the consequences of that, just that driving sense of we did something to cause this, or you know, what have I done to cause this? And the last thing is, I would say, is sin or self-preservation or blame shifting. I kind of combine those two. Anyway, we have about 7 minutes left, and that's good because I have 7 theories of original sin. They don't really need to be horribly talked about, but we can pick this up. So I'll give them to you. They go by different names. I chose names that I thought were helpful. The first one is this is how sin has been passed down and why we consider ourselves sinful, or what the manner in which sin has been passed down. A representative theory, which is most of Protestantism, and this is that Adam and Eve were the legal representation for all humanity. So then guilt was imputed to us or assigned to us because we share in the quality of being human. So that's the representative theory. The second theory is the realist theory. And this actually was popularized by St. Augustine in the 5th century. I thought I said Siri. This is the natural headship, that all humanity is represented in Adam and actually participated in his sin. That in a natural theory of being passed down in some sort of embodied way, that guilt of sin, because we all are human, we all participated in it. That lost weight in probably the Reformation, late medieval period of the Reformation. The privation theory, which would resonate with Roman Catholics, and that is a loss of holiness. So we were deprived of the holiness, and the Catholic theory general throughout history, historically, has lent itself to not being born with a stain of sin, but we rather disinherited that sin. This is why Roman Catholics do have some notion of perfectionism within their doctrines. You know, the Pope could be perfect, someone could be theoretically sinless, someone can attain that sense of holiness as receiving the full inheritance and no longer being deprived. The Orthodox have something that has been referred to as the ancestral sin theory, and that is a rejection of the personal guilt that comes along, but that you inherited the consequences of sin through your ancestors. And those consequences would be things like mortality, the capacity to suffer, a weakened will.
So you have a genetic predisposition to sin.
Essentially. Yeah, which I would agree with, to be honest with you. I think it's both, biological and it's also spiritual. Evolutionary, and this is where it dips somewhat out of the sort of mainline or Roman Catholic or Protestant or Orthodox traditions. This is where it gets a little bit into, but original sin is a metaphor, that there was no original sin, that humans, as they developed from primates, basically were always self-interested, and that that what we call sin is just sort of the evolution of humanity.
It wasn't an event.
It wasn't, what's that? It wasn't an event, it's just something that is a part, I mean, animals are selfish in that way, they're self-preserving. The sixth is a social transmission, and that is that the original sin isn't biological, but it's environmental. And as we'll talk about in weeks to come, when we talk about the theories of atonement, about what Christ did on the cross, those who ascribe to a moral exemplar or moral example theory of the atonement, that Christ just came to give us an example of a better way of being, they are the ones who feel like, well, you're all born in a pure state, but these sinful behaviors are passed down through you, through modeling, through watching. And then the last one, which has been deemed heavily as a heresy of the church, would be the rejectionism or rejection theory, or Pelagianism. Pelagian was the sort of originator of this idea that we are born in a perfect state. Everyone is born without stain, guilt, or culpability. The reason we sin is because it's modeled for us as well, but it denies any stain of notion of original sin. So social transmission is still leaves room for a theoretical stain, but not necessarily a physical stain. And then rejectionism says there is no stain. We are born in the same state that Adam and Eve were born. Now the challenge of that is, then what is Christ dying for when you get down that far? What is true from the Orthodox to the Catholic to the Protestant views are that there is some effect on us. And that's the important thing. We don't really know how it breaks down, but that there is a stain of original sin. Personally, Jason speaking, I think it has to do with the physicality. I think there's a reason that Mary was a virgin. I think the process of procreation, of passing down of seed, of the genetic mixing, of mingling, that the reason Jesus was not touched with the stain of sin is because he didn't contain male sperm, if you want to put it on a very physical level. But I also think there's spiritual entities and realities that get passed down too. Environmental realities, why do sins get passed down from one generation? Well, there's the genetic predispositions, there's behavioral patterns, there's spiritual oppression, there's all those things that factor in. There's probably not one or the other. So, but the important thing about the view of original sin is not what view you hold, but that we acknowledge that there is a stain of sin in some way on us, and that Christ redeemed us for that. All right, that's it for this week.
Well, I never knew that after he threw them out, he put an angel there and a sword of fire to guard the path, so they
Yes.
couldn't go back to the tree.
Yeah. So you should watch the Simpsons, the Simpsons Bible Stories episode. You probably could just find it on
Oh,
YouTube.
Is that what we did, the Mormon one?
No, the Mormon one was South Park, which is fantastic. The Simpsons has a Bible story, and they kick Homer out, and then he uses the last unicorn to dig a hole on the other side of the fence and back in. So he's like pops out this unicorn, and he's like, "Oh, I'm back in!" And the unicorn dies, and he's like, "Oh, I think that was the last one." Anyway,
Yeah, I never.
we should.
I suppose I read that one, but I didn't remember that.
All right, we'll see you next week, folks. Or actually, next week,
All right,
I'll be at camp. We'll be here, but I'll be the following week. We'll be back on, so not next week. And that'll be in my email this week. So, but all right,
all right, thank you.
thanks, you all.
Thank you.
You know that.